Welcome. You are listening to a 2019 Right on Con podcast. My name is Jade and I'm part of the Right on Con team. And I'm absolutely thrilled to chat today with author Amelinda Berube all about spooky stories in YA. Thank you so much for joining me today, Amelinda.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure too. For those of you who may not know, Amelinda is the author of The Dark Beneath the Ice, which is out now. And Here There Are Monsters, coming out in August this year, which I am also super excited for. Amelinda, what was the first thing that really drew you to write about spooky subjects?
That's not a question that I had actually really analyzed before, because I think I've always been drawn to spooky stories, like going right back to Dr. Seuss. There's a story about the pale green pants with nobody inside them.
Oh,
which is my very favorite.
Yeah, that's a spooky one.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think what it comes down to is that whenever you're reading a book, you want to be moved in some way, right?
Yeah.
The books that I most admire are the books that make me laugh, or the books that make me cry. And I think the books that scare the hell out of me are, that's another way for a book to move you. It's another way for a book to, affect your feelings and make you, I don't know, I guess maybe make you interact with, the world, with things that you're afraid of without them being right in your face. So, a book that makes you cry, you can feel all the feels without having to be in that place. It's the same thing with scary books, that you can explore those feelings without real danger.
Yeah, so you're not exactly in the situation, but you get secondhand spooky feelings from reading it.
Yeah, exactly. It's a way to explore those dark and scary things without without the danger that comes with them. When you go, you can go diving with sharks and be in a cage, right? So that you're protected a little bit, but you still get a way to think about those things, and a way to sort of come sideways at some of those things without having to face them face on in your life in front of you that's going to eat you.
Yeah, not that diving with sharks is number one on my list, but yeah, I absolutely get what you mean. Yeah, so I suppose we go forwards on to the questions then. That what is your definition of spooky? Is there a difference between spooky literature and scary literature?
I think maybe the reason that I tend to use spooky is, maybe scary feels a little presumptuous, because, it's like saying that, okay, here's a book, like my book will make you cry. Like you can't really assume that, a book that makes you cry or a book that makes you laugh. It's a really personal kind of effect. Everybody's got their scary buttons that they're, that they're really affected by different things. And some, a book that is terrifying to one person will leave another completely unmoved. So I think, that's part of it. And also maybe that, I think spooky might be a little broader than scary, because you can have a book that's, dripping with atmosphere, but isn't actively frightening necessarily, that it's just, that it has that sort of aesthetic sense of, like a really haunted or gothic feel to it, without actively trying to, I guess, be frightening. And I think those are part of the same family, and you can appreciate a spooky book, even if you're kind of a wimp when it comes to scary things, right?
Yeah.
So
like me.
Yeah, I think that's the distinction for me.
Yeah, because for instance, I suppose going to the more maybe hardcore sort of thing, Walking Dead for me is terrifying.
I noped right out of The Walking Dead.
Oh yeah, same. But it's kind of like, for other people, they can handle it. They're fine with it. They enjoy that. But for me, it's just a little bit too much. So I suppose, yeah, it's a kind of difference within that, I suppose. And, how does the genre of spooky change in tone for different age ranges? Does it necessarily change from middle grade books and YA? Do they have the same sort of feel?
I think what really changes is the questions that they're tackling with the spooky feeling. Like in middle grade, it's really interesting that, like I've heard, I've read articles talking about this, and I think there's a lot of people, maybe especially girls, who go through the stage around the age of 12 where they're really interested in ghosts and the supernatural and,
Mm.
seances and that kind of thing. And, a lot of spooky middle grade actually covers surprisingly heavy emotional territory that has to do with that first, I guess maybe you're first becoming aware of mortality, of death. Um, so when you look at books like The Land of Yesterday, or The In Between, Wait Till Helen Comes, like those books are scary the way they are because there's this live wire of real feeling a, about a real and very scary subject. Um, and I think when you take that to YA, it's sort of gone a little further to maybe an awareness, like a more concrete awareness that, oh, there are people out there, there can be people out there who want to hurt you,
Yeah.
and or that there can be, um, it sort of becomes a more social dynamic um, rather than sort of this general question. And I like, and this is maybe why, like, and so you get more graphic and you get more violence, and you sort of have, I think you have more of a, this is where where you see more of the, the slashers or whatever, as opposed to the supernatural horror, which is sort of more of a, I guess maybe lends itself more to those big questions. But like that's but not that there's not supernatural horror in YA, but it seems like the questions become more about, like, where are you in relation to other people, and um what are the horrifying things that can happen between people.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting actually because you were mentioning like the middle grade, age 12, and you get the girls mainly, I suppose, going into the supernatural. I was one of those. I,
Me
I
too.
definitely was going into all those spooky stories around that age. And I suppose, yes, it does change in that sort of social awareness because but it might be different in America. I'm in England, if you can't tell. Um, so it may be different in the way that the school and the social structure is as to how or what we perceive as spooky in YA.
Hmm.
But what, in your opinion, makes for a good spooky story? Is there anything that you can attribute to tropes or themes? What are the elements that kind of attribute really good sense of spookiness to a story?
Well, I think, like, this gets super personal. So my opinions here may not extend to everybody. Um, but for myself, the what makes a story really spooky and really effective for me is, like, first of all, that it's dripping with atmosphere. That there's a feeling that just permeates the book, and that stays with you after you put it down. That to me is sort of the most important thing. Um, and also that it doesn't explain too much. Um,
Mm.
that there's some room to connect the dots yourself, to for your imagination to become involved, because like, once you explain something, it's a known quantity. It's you can wrap your head around it, and it's not as scary anymore. So like, I have no trouble with books that leave things quite free floating and don't pin things down, um, which some people get really frustrated with because they find it confusing. But I love that.
Mm.
That to me is what lets it be scary to me. Um, and that it strikes the right balance maybe between following the rules and breaking them.
Yeah.
Because if you get super rule bound in a story, like when you think about a traditional ghost story, a traditional ghost story has certain forms, like, and maybe here's where we get into tropes, right? A ghost story has certain conventions that it follows. There's something left undone, there's something that has to be set right. The ghost is trying to communicate, or that somebody has to, that there is a thing that you have to do to make this right and to make it stop, right?
Yeah.
And but if you hew too closely to that, like, you read a lot of classic ghost stories, and they're not really that scary because you can, that they follow that rhythm that in your head, and they're not threatening because they're, in some sense, they're a known quantity. So, there's, to really be scary, I think a story has to find a way to break some of those conventions, or to turn them on their head, so that that threat is unleashed, so that there's
Yeah.
a certain extent to which you don't know what's going to happen. Like, I always think here about the Blair Witch Project,
Oh, yeah.
which, like, you can think about, like, all the classic fairy tale rules, like what you could do in this situation, and it's, but it didn't follow any of them. It had its own internal logic, but you had no access to it.
Yeah.
And there was nothing, like, what are you going to do, you know
Mm.
excuse me.
No, don't worry.
So I think, in terms of what would make a bad spooky story, um, I think the big one for me is when it uses tropes without really questioning them or thinking about them. And I think the big one there is using mental illness in a cavalier sort of way.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's really easy to, to sort of be throwing that question around without, or to be talking about, an insane asylum, or that kind of thing, or using the threat of, like, oh, if you're, what if I'm crazy, I'm going to be hospitalized, to be using that as sort of the worst possible thing without really giving it any thought.
Yeah.
And, that sort of reinforces these sort of stereotypical fears without exploring them, without examining them.
Yeah.
And I'm also not a fan of, sort of grossness for the sake of being gross. Um, I think there's other people who react differently to gore, but personally, like, I don't know, I tend to react to it kind of like, well, what's your point? If you're,
Mm.
like, there are some books, like, Not Even Bones, that use it beautifully, because they're using it to a purpose. But if you're just kind of splashing blood around, it kind of, like, it ceases to be scary because you get hardened to it, you know.
Yeah.
Um, and again, this is strictly my opinion. So, I'm sure there are other people who can weigh in about, like, the uses of gore, but that's my feeling anyway.
Yeah, and I suppose there's a fine line in a lot of literature that would be between spooky and horror.
Hmm.
So it's kind of treading a fine line between them if you include a lot of horror elements, but maybe it's a genre mash, but I do get that. I think there is a particular flavor of spooky, and I agree. The overuse of gore for me personally is a little bit excessive, but when done, it can create a lot of atmosphere. I do agree. And I suppose, speaking of horror as well, what larger genres do spooky stories fit into, would you say?
I'd say pretty much any of them. I think, like, it's so much a question of atmosphere, and that really reaches across
Hmm.
genre lines. Um, I think anything that brings that feeling, really, and that, uh, I guess, addresses those kinds of questions would fit that would fit that type. Like, I'm trying to think of like, sort of the more upbeat genres. Like, I'm not sure, I'm trying to think of how you would have like a spooky romance, for example. But, you can certainly mash up, I'm thinking funny and spooky, like, Derek Millman's Scream All Night,
Yeah.
which is completely delightful, but which I would also call a spooky book. So,
yeah, I think as well. Would you say that a story, this wanting to create atmospheres, wanting to be very spooky, does it necessarily have to have fantasy elements? What might an author do if they want to set a spooky story in space, for example? Atmosphere is so important, but how would they be able to change that and still retain the spookiness that we all love?
see, I think, personally, I talk a lot about supernatural elements because I love them so much. I really see people falling into sort of one of two categories with their scary books. Either it's, you know, either it's supernatural or it's realistic. There's people, like I was talking to another 2018 debut, Sean Sarlis. I'm not sure
Mm-hmm.
if I'm pronouncing his name right, but his book Campfire also came out this summer. Excuse me. And he was saying that, for him, he finds a real person with a knife who's after you a lot scarier than anything supernatural because it's real.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm completely the opposite. I tend to feel like, the person after you with a knife, like, well, that's the news. Right.
Right now,
So,
yeah.
it just depends. It depends which of those, it depends on what your buttons are, like what gets to you. So, I certainly think that, and so depending on what it is that you want to do, you can absolutely have a scary story that's based around, real life, bad guys, real life people who mean you harm. And, like there's so much of, when I'm glad you used the example of space because, you think of a movie like Event Horizon, for example. I'm trying to think of a book that does this, and there's not one that springs to mind. But where, like space is incredibly hostile, or indifferent, like it's inimical to life, right? And it's completely unknown, right? So you can really trade on that feeling of, of being, like, and that almost becomes like that really gothic feeling of being in this haunted landscape that is out to get you, that means you harm. Um,
Very
and
desolate.
yeah, exactly. And that you could turn it into, desolate isolation. You could turn it into a very claustrophobic kind of, like you're trapped in this little tin can in the middle of space, you could really bring that atmosphere to, to all kinds of different scenarios. And I mean, like you think about it, I mean, like even Star Trek had spooky episodes, right?
Oh yeah, some of the best ones.
Yeah, exactly.
So I suppose one of the books that I immediately thought of if I was to think of something spooky in space is Illuminae.
Oh, okay, I haven't
Um,
read that one yet. I'll
yeah,
have
I
to bump
mean,
that up my list then.
it is. I mean, some people may argue it's slightly got some horror elements because it's sort of got some zombies type things in there, which is something that I cannot handle anyway.
Oh,
Um,
really?
but yeah, it is. I think what it does well is atmosphere and the build up of tension and the build up of, oh, something's going to go down here. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's, maybe what you were speaking before about atmosphere. That is something that I think can really lend itself to tension and less edge of your seat, but, gripping the pages and going, I need to figure out what comes next.
Mm-hmm.
But I think
Absolutely.
it's maybe a good one in space, but I think that there's different things that you can do with anything in spooky genre. I think it's wide open, really. Again,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, like you say, difficult to do it in romance, but not impossible.
Yeah, it's all about the feeling of the story, right? You know,
Yeah.
if you create that, I don't know, that what would you even call it? Like that thrill, that, you know, that oppressive feeling, you know, the isolation and the danger. That's what
Mm.
sort of drives the engine.
Yeah, and I just thought of Crimson Peak as a possible for romantic tension and spookiness.
Oh, that's true. Yeah,
Yeah, it's
because
amazing
I would have.
what you don't realize.
Yeah, exactly. Like when they, you know, and I suppose like there's a whole. I was reading an article a little while ago that was going around Twitter about like there's a whole genre of gothic romance, right?
Mm.
So
Which I have yet to read a lot of, but it certainly
yeah,
intrigues
same
me.
here. But it's out there.
Yeah, I mean, why do you think that readers enjoy spooky stories in the first place? What do you think draws people to it? I mean, I know we said before that there was like a safety element of it, but people still really seem to resonate with spookiness. I mean, Halloween is still very popular. So, what do you feel
I think
gives it that in longevity?
I think it's that exact thing about like balancing on that edge. You know, everybody puts that edge in a different place. You know, like it's the line between, I think I've said this elsewhere, but it's the line between, you know, the nightmare that you wake up from, sort of, you know, and your heart is beating faster, but you're sort of going, cool, you know, and then there's the nightmare that you wake up from screaming.
Yeah.
You know, there's that, and everybody draws that line in different places. There's the, you can enjoy it up to a certain point in safety, and there's everybody has a line where past that point, you know, you're out there swimming with the sharks without the cage and it's too real and you nope out,
Yeah.
right? You know, and for me, like watching Walking Dead, you know, as soon as I found out that there was going to be a baby on that show, I was like, nope, nope, can't, nope, that's the end. That
Yeah.
was the point at which I noped out. Like, I really enjoy zombies, you know, which is kind of surprising because, like, generally, like, you know, they're a lot grosser than the stuff that usually, you know, catches my attention that way. But yeah, no, it's like, you know, threats to babies is where I nope out. Like, cannot cannot cope with that, you
Yeah.
know. And everybody puts that line in a different place. So I think
Mhm.
what people are looking for in a spooky book is, you know, that cage so that you can swim around with the sharks, right? You know, the thing
Yeah.
that keeps you safe. Because if it doesn't keep you safe, you won't read it, right?
Right.
If you don't feel safe enough reading it, you nope out. And lots
Hmm.
of people do that with, you know, scary books in general. It's just too intense.
Yeah, it's interesting
So,
that you said about the everybody's line is in a different place. I think, yeah, again, going with Walking Dead for an example, at the end of the first episode, spoiler if you haven't seen it, but as soon as they attacked the horse, I was done. I thought, I can't do this. I didn't even know that there was a baby coming into it, but that's still icky for me. But I was
yeah.
like, nope, the horse is in danger. I can't watch this. In no way can I watch this horse at this mercy of zombies. So yeah, yeah. It's always about what you're comfortable with, and maybe
Mhm.
teetering on the edge of being comfortable sometimes. But I know that you've mentioned The In Between and Scream All Night as books that do spooky well. Are there any more examples of good stories to check out that you personally have been spooked by?
Oh, I have such a list. Um, to name a couple that just came out this year, the couple that I really enjoyed were The Wicked Deep by Shay
Oh,
Earnshaw, which is deliciously spooky, and The Hazelwood, which also has like this, you know, it's spooky in the way that fairy tales are spooky, you know, and it
mm,
feels like it has so much to do with fairy tales, and it really feels like it understands them in a really visceral and unapologetic way that I really enjoyed. Um, I also I recently read a book called The November Girl by Lydia Kang that was absolutely stunning. And it really does that gothic haunted landscape really beautifully. Um, it's set on an island in the middle of Lake Superior, um, and the way it takes the changing season and the landscape and just makes it something so um, so alive and so sinister is
Mm.
really breathtaking. Um, and pick up anything basically by Nova Rensuma.
Oh
My
yeah.
favorites of hers are Imaginary Girls and The Walls Around Us. Um, her prose is so stunning and so atmospheric, like all the way through, and she writes sort of reality with a twist,
Hmm.
so that it's super literary, and then there's just this one thing that's a little weird, and you have to you sort of have to keep reading and put together for yourself what's going on.
Yeah.
um and the other uh author that I will read anything she writes is Frances Harding. um
Oh.
After reading Cuckoo Song, that was the most breathtakingly terrifying fantasy. It was wonderful. And there's a point about 40 pages in where like I can't really describe it because I don't want to spoil it for people, but there's a detail that she drops at the end of this one scene that just made me sink down in my chair, just leaking tea kettle noises, like oh my god, it was fantastic.
That is
um
the reaction you want if you're writing something spooky. That is the
exactly.
ultimate reaction.
Exactly. And it was just that one little detail that just, oh my god, it was so beautiful. um and there's also, like, to pick a couple of Canadian authors, The Night Gardener by Jonathan Oxier.
Mm.
Again, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right. It's bizarre and completely original. I guess it was based on a nightmare he had at some point. um and it's completely terrifying and delicious. And there's also one by Kenneth Oppel called The Nest, um, which technically is middle grade, but, like, oh man, it has to do with wasps.
Oh,
And, like, yeah, right. As soon as you say that, it's like you sort of get the feeling that comes with this book. It was really
yeah.
that, it was magnificent. It involved, like, finding, a wasp nest, like, built basically all the way through a house. And it was, oh my god, it was really scary.
Oh,
So I could go on and on, but those are some standout titles.
yeah. I'm gonna add some of those to my Goodreads. I've had The Wicked Deep on my radar for a while now, so it's good to know that it delivers as well.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely, yeah.
so a lot of our listeners will be writers themselves. Do you have any other advice for authors on how to approach maybe their first spooky book, or just putting in some additional spooky elements to something to make it more atmospheric?
I think my biggest advice is to, I guess in a sense, to reiterate that old saw, like, write what you know, but in the sense of, like, um, pick a place that you find spooky and write about it, or pick
Yeah.
tropes that you find spooky and write about those. Like, write about what scares you. Like, no fear. Like, they say no tears in the author, no tears in the reader, and it's the same thing with spookiness. Like, if
Yeah.
you're not, if this isn't what harrows up your soul, you're not going to get to your reader. And I would say too that if you can, and, like, this is the hard part, you know also write about what genuinely scares you. Like, and I
Mm.
don't even mean in a spooky way, like, what frightens you. You know, like, what's the worst thing you've ever done? What are you afraid is true? Or what are you afraid to talk about? These are like, it's a really great tool to work on those things, to work through those things. And that fear really comes through the execution. Like, you can feel it. Like those stories that have that live wire at the heart, that's what it is. It's a, like, there's a core of genuine feeling in the best spooky stories, and if you can harness that, you'll really speak to people.
Yeah.
And like, and don't be afraid to get a little emo, you know. Don't be afraid to be dramatic. Like, get in your feels. These are the big questions, like, these are the big, it is dramatic. So, like, go for it. Don't feel like you have to hold back and sort of be ironic and, and like second guess yourself. Just like go for broke, you know. Like, and I'm, like, speaking of the like, when I was working on, like, people will tell me whether or not they felt like they got that live wire feeling from my debut, right? Like, I can't judge that, but like, I can say that, there was a lot, it's not a coincidence that that story involves so much anxiety, and, particularly, anxiety about owning your sexuality, anxiety about losing control.
Yeah.
Those were, those were things that I was really struggling to talk about, and that, I found, I don't know, I guess I found a way through that story. And I hope that comes across. I'm not, like, I can't, it's an effect on a reader, right? So I can't say myself whether it does. But, like, I felt like the reason I finally had success with that story was because I managed in some way a little bit to tap into those things.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. If you don't feel anything as you're writing it as an author, your audience probably won't feel it either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah,
So
exactly. So it's hard to get into that place, like, it's hard to, um, because we're trained so much to keep our distance from the big feels. And, like, when you get into your big feels that, it's melodramatic, it's embarrassing, it's, people kind of move away from that. They're a little uncomfortable about it. So it's hard to give yourself permission to go there. But it can be really effective if you do, and it can be really cathartic too, like, I feel like I work through things writing spooky stories.
yeah,
So, you know.
yeah. I think you brought up some really good points throughout every single question that I've asked so far. And, I could literally talk about spookiness and compare notes and everything all day. But I think we're out of time at the moment. And I just want to say thank you so much for joining me. I will definitely check out some of the books that you have recommended, because I like being a little bit scared. That middle grade reader that I was when I was 12, she definitely gravitated towards spooky. So thank you so much. For all our listeners who maybe want to follow you or see what you're up to, where can they find you online?
I am mostly on Twitter. I kind of use it to get through my day. So
Yeah.
you can find me at Metuiteme, which is MET. Oh my God. METUIT. Oh, Jesus. I'm going to have to look this up. 1 minute. I can't spell that off the top of my head. Isn't that sad?
That's why I chose.
MET. Sorry.
Yeah.
METUITEME.
Okay.
Or you could just look me up by name and that'll find it.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I chose a very bland name for all sorts of things. I thought, I'm not going to be
That's
able to
probably
remember.
smart. Yeah.
Okay.
So
Well,
I'm on both Twitter and Instagram under that handle. And my website is also www.metuiteme.com.
Brilliant. Okay, cool. And obviously
Yeah.
your books will be available from all good bookstores and online to pre-order now.
As far as I know, yep. I don't think the second one is up for pre-order yet, but it should be soon.
Brilliant. Well, thank you ever so much again for joining me and spending the time talking to me about spookiness and the wonder of the genre. And to everyone listening at Right On Con 2019, thank you so much for joining us as well. If you'd like to take part in the discussion, we would love for you to do so in the comments of the podcast page. So enjoy the rest of the conference and happy writing. Thank you again, Amelinda.
Thank you.